Hello, and welcome back to What is the Bible and What's Inside. My name's Rory. I'm Methodist minister in Haxby and Wigginton and part of the team at Central Methodist Church in York. And this is the 8th session in what will be 9 sessions, about half an hour each, taking a very, very big, broad overview of the whole of the Bible. What's in it, looking at the sections of it from the beginnings of the Old Testament, looking at where it comes from, where the writings originated, how they've been edited, what scholars have to say about them, and a little bit about how we might use them in the church's life. What we expect from them when we read them. Lots of different categories of writing, lots of different genres and types of writing through the whole of the Bible. And if you go back to the beginning of the series, it's all on the church's YouTube channel. You can see as we look through each of the sections how they are categorized into broadly similar sets of writings. Of course, we know that over a period of many thousands of years, these books have been passed on in an oral tradition and then written down. Some of them directly written down as letters. We're looking at letters today, and then found their way into written form, been edited, been joined together, been used by some of the writings, especially in the Gospels. As we looked at those, some of those writers clearly used the first recorded writings of other Gospels to make sense of their own story, to shape it, to pad it out with other material. It's a complex and fascinating set of books, a library of books that, depending on how you want to view it, are historically accurate descriptions of the story of God journeying with the nation of Israel through the person of Jesus into the world today. Or at the other end of the spectrum, they are what they are, very human writings that do their best to try and explain out of a particular worldview in a particular moment. An individual or a community or a nation's understanding of its place in the world, its understanding of God in its life, its making sense of times of great prosperity, times of great suffering, and in all of that, the overarching question, or the very strong statement that we must now wrestle with today: where is God in all of this? Or this is where God is in all of this. When we do biblical studies, what scholars do who do biblical studies is they look at the Bible not so much as a religious text, but as a literary text. And so some of what we're talking about in this series is the formation of the literature, what actually fundamentally what it is and how it came to be as it is, before we ask any questions about how it might be used and applied. What is there to learn from it about its authorship, about the intent of the authors, about the editorial activity that might have taken place in order for us to arrive into the final form that we have it now. So today we're going to be in what sounds like an enormous chunk of the Bible, dealing with 21 out of 66 books. Across the whole of the scriptures in the church that I'm part of, the Methodist Church, our Bible contains 66 books, Old and New Testament together. And today we're dealing with 21 of them. They are, however, quite short. What we're looking at are all of the epistles in the New Testament, the letters written to individual churches, written to individual people, and written more broadly to a wider early church audience. They're all in the New Testament. They come after the Acts of the Apostles, which is the book we looked at last time, following on from the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we have 21 books traditionally divided up into a section of 14 and then a section of 7. And the section of 14, the first 14, are arranged not in chronological order. They're arranged pretty much in the order of their length in Greek, with one notable exception. But they are all attributed to the Apostle Paul, who is one of the two main characters that we have in all of the stories we read in the Acts of the Apostles. The Apostle Paul, who on at least 3 missionary journeys into Asia Minor and what is now Greece, or was even then mostly Greece, all across that region around Israel and to the west, to the east of Israel. We find writings that are attributed historically and traditionally to the Apostle Paul. And then the last 7 are general letters written in terms of their authorship by the people whose names appear on them, by John, by Peter, by Timothy, not Timothy, Jude and James. the letters of Timothy are letters to Timothy ascribed to Paul, and we'll talk about those in a moment. So that's what we're looking at, and we're going to begin with an overview of the letters that are attributed to the Apostle Paul, and look at how trustworthy it is to make that claim, and what they are about, and to whom they are addressed, and maybe have a look at the chronology of them, not so much the way that we have them in the order in the Bible, but the order in which we think they were probably written. It is self-evident that when the Apostle Paul wrote letters to churches and to individuals, when he sat down or wherever he was sitting down to write the letter to the Romans, which is the first and the longest of those, or 1 and 2 Corinthians, we do know there was at least one other Corinthians letter we have no surviving record of, maybe 2. When he sat down to write those and the other letters ascribed to him, traditionally or historically accurately, we can say with a great deal of confidence that he had no intention for them to be read in 21st century Britain or any part of the world today. That their purpose was to reveal something, to teach something, to talk about issues that were about the nature of the church, the nature of God, the nature of a people's faith, as it mushroomed and grew, as it found itself in many places, a very small group of people in a very different culture, religiously at least, trying to make sense of what it meant to follow Jesus in those times. So we must begin there, because it's important to begin there. No one can say that Paul's intention, with any reasonableness, that Paul's intention was to write universal truths or universal doctrine or universal principles that guide the church's practice and discipline and hierarchy. Today, no one can say with any real conviction that stands up to any scrutiny that was Paul's intention. So we begin by making that assertion, and it's an important one to make, because in many of the debates that are part of the Christian faith's life at the moment, part of the church's life, not least arguments, discussions, and journeying or properly getting stuck in issues around human sexuality, it is very easy to lift a verse here or there out of Paul or someone else's writing or any part of the Bible and say, this is a universal truth that will always be the case and has been handed down to us in that way. Of course, you can say that. There's nothing stopping anyone saying that. But it is a problematic way of reading the Bible, not least because in Paul's writings, like in many of the other parts of the Bible, we do find bluntly contradictory passages. And so we need to spend a bit of time with that and ask why they're there and what that means. Whether in these letters, these 14 letters ascribed to Paul, which we're going to just break apart a little bit in a moment, whether we are looking for somehow for God's voice to be shining through with great authority above and beyond, or just using the voice of Paul, or whether we are seeing something of a human being's traveling and journeying with his own sense of faith and God and his own experience and his own transformation, something we know from his writings and from his talking about his travels in the Acts of the Apostles as they're recorded. We know that Paul is changing and growing as he writes. And so part of the fascination of this literature is to see how, in his writing, in dealing with particular issues, how he might be developing, how he might be maturing, how he might be getting it wrong, frankly, early on, and changing his mind about things. So let's spend a bit of time with those 14 letters which are ascribed to Paul. And let's deal with them perhaps in chronological order at least, and then in order as well within that of those considered confidently to be his own writings, and then those considered writings that come about in some other form. So First Thessalonians, it's widely held that that's the oldest of these letters. It's a small letter, but it's argued that that's the first. Then Galatians, then 1 Corinthians, and then Philippians, Philemon, very short letter. Some of these are, the longest Romans in the Bible I use is about 12, 13 pages, and 2 of the smallest are barely a page. Philemon, one of the smallest ones. And then 2 Corinthians, and then Romans. These are the 7 letters that most scholars are agreed are Pauline letters, that he wrote these. These are his first handwritings written to these churches in this chronology. as part of responding to or preparing, responding to visits he's already made to places, or preparing the way for missionary journeys he wants to undertake. And then there's a kind of even divide on the authenticity as letters written by Paul for the letters written to the Colossians and then 2nd Thessalonians. And sometimes that, you can read up more on this if you want to, but sometimes that is about style, sometimes it's about content, it's about particular words or phrases that are part of all of our lives in various ways. I've discovered in preparing these videos and watching them back to make sure that I say something mostly sensible, that I have not just mannerisms, but I have little turns of phrase that appear again and again and again that I use regularly. And we find that in writing as well. And so there are little clues as to the consistent authorship of a particular set of letters, or questions that arise because some of that changes. And we have to ask, even though it's written in a Pauline style, whether we can truly say this is part of Paul's writings, or whether someone else has written kind of on his behalf, or perhaps edited beyond that, these writings. And then I'll introduce you to my word of the day, pseudepigrapha. Pseudepigrapha. So there are 4 letters that are considered pseudepigraphic, which means that they are attributed to Paul, but are, according to most scholars, most definitely not written by Paul, because their style, their tone, the language they use, the ideas, the theology we find in them, while it is broadly in consensus with Paul's, has enough divergence that we can say we're quite sure that these were written in his name, but not written by him. And those are Ephesians, 1st and 2nd letters to Timothy, and then Titus. And then there's an outlier, and the outlier is the book of Hebrews. It's anonymous, it's not really in the form of a letter, it's long been included among Paul's collected letters, and some scholars believe that it was attributed to Paul to give it a kind of apostolic authority, but it is quite a long letter compared to those that come before it, and it comes right at the end of this section of 14 letters. But it is widely held that the author of Hebrews is not Paul at all, and we're not sure exactly where it comes from. Neither modern scholarship or church teaching really ascribes Hebrews to the Apostle Paul. So what we have here is we have evidence of someone's journeying, in the order in which I shared the chronology of those, and I'll be posting some links perhaps at the end of this, or you just go onto again, I'll say it, Wikipedia. What a wonderful resource in giving us just bite-sized chunks of biblical knowledge. But you can go there, and if you look there under the Pauline Epistles, you'll find the list that I've just been looking at, which talks about the chronology, the order in which these books were written. And as part of reading them, one of the ways of doing that would be to read them in the order that we think they appear, the order in which they're written. And so to read first the book of 1 Thessalonians, and then Galatians, and then 1 Corinthians, and then Philippians, Philemon, 2 Corinthians, Romans. One of the reasons to do that would be to see Paul's development. I mean, they're all written in quite a short period of time. We think maybe about 6, 7, or 8 years. So it's not a long time, but in terms of life experience, when you read the Acts of the Apostles and you think about the things that Paul describes in the letters, a huge amount of life experience, a huge amount of transformation, a huge amount of wonder, peril, conflict, disaster, things that would fill a lifetime for most of us, happening in quite a short period of time in Paul's life. You get perhaps a glimpse into the way that his own faith and life and theology and understanding of himself as an apostle changes over the course of time. What is most affirmed and what is most challenged, and how he deals with issues like the place of women in the church's life, how he deals with it perhaps differently in different places. One of the arguments being that in the chronology of the letters we see something of his journeying. Or we see something of some editing, some adding, some essentially some highlighting of ideas that suited a church better, or suited the wider church better in its retelling of Paul's letters over time. One of the things that I've been trying to say through all of the series is it's good to be appropriately suspicious of the Bible. Not in a sense of I don't trust you to tell the truth, but simply to say in all of the writing we have a particular perspective offered by somebody. And that suspicion isn't so much about standing back and saying prove yourself to me, because the Bible can't do that. But it is about knowing that there's room for questions and room for doubt. There's room to really struggle with large parts of Scripture or just individual verses, especially when they don't seem to cohere with our understanding of God, our experience of God, the church's life as it is now, or just bluntly contradict places elsewhere in the Bible. Part of the whole point of this is to say, as a piece of literature, what do we learn about the authors and their experience and their intent, for good or ill, that comes about because of the way that they write down and proclaim and make eternal, in some ways, through church history, these particular stories. So we start with Paul's letters, which are, as I've said already, a mixed bag, because we're not we know that they weren't all written by him, but within his own traveling and with his own with various companions along the way, and others who may have called themselves his disciples, just those who learn from him. Disciple doesn't mean worshipper; it just means student of. That perhaps some of their pens contributed significantly or in whole to some of those letters. And then we do know there are some lost letters of Paul. We do know that, as I've said already, there's a first letter to Corinth, which is referenced in 1 Corinthians, but which you obviously haven't got, because 1 Corinthians is the 1 Corinthians we've got. And then a third letter as well to Corinth. An earlier letter to the Ephesians, which is referenced in the book of Ephesians. And then a letter to the Laodiceans, which he refers to in Colossians. How these books came to be held together, came to become canon, came to become the Bible and Scripture as we understand it and use it today, is again a long and circuitous story. The first collection of letters that we believe came into existence was a collection held in the 2nd century. Although it's possible that Paul collected his letters himself, made copies of them, or had some of his disciples make copies of them. Sorry, that's a dustbin lorry. For publication himself. It was normal practice in his time for letter writers to keep a copy for themselves and send a copy elsewhere. So I've now closed the window, and hopefully the bin lorry won't make quite so much noise. I'll just move on. We've looked at Paul. We talked a bit about Paul's letters and how his letters both fit into a chronology and then into a tradition, and how scholarship has unpacked some of the discrepancies and some of the questions about their writings, and also the fact that his intention and his own disciples' intentions was never to write something that would become Scripture as we have it today. And then following on from those 14 letters, ending with the slightly mysterious Hebrews, we have what are called the Catholic Epistles. Catholic, not Roman Catholic, Catholic just meaning universal, because they're not written necessarily and addressed to any particular community, but they are written generally to the church, it would seem. And those are the letter of James, and then the 1st and 2nd letters of Peter, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd letters of John, and then the book of Jude, the Epistle of Jude. And they take quite different forms to the Pauline letters. They are attributed, the authorship is attributed to James, to Peter, to John, and to Jude. But we're not entirely sure what to do with that. We're not sure. Again, scholarship is in doubt, is not sure with regards to the authorship of these. They are fairly consistent across themselves. So 1 and 2 Peter are quite consistent, as are the 1st, 2nd and 3rd letters of John. They're very different lengths, but they are coherent in their authorship. But a bit like when we talked about the Gospels, just because we say Matthew, Mark, Luke and John doesn't mean that the apostles Matthew, Mark, Luke and John sat down at some point in their dotage and wrote down the stories of Jesus as they remembered them. Letters are very personal things. Letters are written and Paul's letters and all the letters have within them real human emotion. We find in them the description, the frustration, and the potential solutions for arguments, for dealing with factions within the church. There are instructions about how to best behave and order ourselves towards the things we do together now as they did then. There's a lot in the epistles that is of massive resonance to us, because they aren't historical. They're not telling a historical story. They are letters written by people to people, which makes them deeply personal. Whereas the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles were sort of historical documents, but had a particular story to tell. All of the epistles, all 21 of them, don't really so much have a story to tell. They are about people reaching out to other people with their thoughts, beliefs, ideas, instruction, and suggestions. They are we find within them, we find confession of failing, we find frustration, we find beautiful poetry, we find passages that we use in the best and the worst moments in our human experience. We find deep longing, we find deep conviction, we find strong assertions, and we find great humility. And for that reason alone, they're immensely valuable, because they give us an insight into the human experience and the humanity of those who were writing and those they were writing to. A bit like the section that we dealt with a few weeks ago when we looked at Psalms and Proverbs and Lamentations, when we looked at some of those books that are fundamentally the expressing of human emotion and human story, not so much historical narrative, but what it's like to be ourselves and how we relate to each other and how that makes sense. So traditionally, every Sunday in the church, if we're going to use all three readings, or four sometimes, we have an Old Testament reading, we have a Psalm, we have a Gospel reading, and there's always an epistle. There's always a reading from one of the epistles, one of the letters, almost every Sunday in the use of the lectionary. That's part of helping us to spend time with a great swathe of Scripture over the course of a 3-year period. And the epistles are valuable because they introduce us again to human perspective, human narrative, human longing, human desire, human struggle, and all that it means to be caring for each other, and especially caring for each other at a distance. So I'm not going to go through each of them obviously individually, just going to leave them with you and suggest that if you want to have a look at the Wikipedia pages or other pages that describe them, then just do a search on Wikipedia for Pauline epistles, have a search for Catholic epistles, just have a look at the New Testament section and see where they fit in. But maybe especially, as I've said already, pay attention to the chronology of Paul's letters. And perhaps if you want something to do in terms of Bible reading, as part of exploring this human journey that Paul is on with his own faith and his own confidence and his own convictions and his own desire to tell people how they should behave themselves and what they should do, and his own growing humility that he doesn't perhaps know best for them, that he's made mistakes in the course of his telling them what to do, that there is within that a deep and rich sort of seam of gold to mine when it comes to what faith and conviction and hope and a desire for God might look like in the life of someone. Now, you may just want to read them, as an interesting sort of journey through the history of the early church, and that's fine as well. But of course, they're written by people, for people, and we can never leave that out. So that's about it for today. Next week, I'll be back with the last session that is part of this 9-week series, and we'll be looking at the Revelation of John. Just a light reading to end with, but a really interesting, fascinating, worrying, and problematic book, held up very high by some, dismissed by others, but a book that is full of symbolism, full of language, full of numbers, full of full of visions of what the future will look like and how the world will come to finally realize that God is God and we are not. Visions of heaven, visions of hell, all kinds of things. And I'll do my best next week in half an hour to do justice to some of the ideas that exist around the book of Revelation. But until then, enjoy reading, enjoy listening, enjoy thinking, and I'll see you in a week's time if you'd like to join me for the last of those sessions. As I said before, if you've missed out on any, or this is the first one you've watched, you're welcome to go back, of course, on the church's YouTube page, and just find each of them, beginning with just a broad overview. And there've been 8 sessions so far, including this one, and that'll rob you of about 4 hours of your life, which might be time well spent. So take care.